All right, welcome back to class. I think in continuation with our discussion of Levi's piece that dealt with the levels of analysis framework, I think we had begun by looking at the systemic understanding. Um, and basically, the idea was to look at different levels of analysis that help us make better sense of outcomes such as war, of outcomes such as conflict. Um, what would be these levels of analysis? We had discussed them to be at the level of the system, at the level of the national government, society, and then at the level of individuals, right? Um, just to give a brief recap of what we discussed under each of these levels, I think we had um, discussed the level of the system to mean the kind of anarchy that realists ascribe to the international system. Um, that sort of anarchy is characterized by the absence of an ordering hierarchical principle in the international system, which basically means that self-help is the only way out for states. That's the systems level understanding, right? If we look at the national government society, we would look at questions as we had discussed in the last class relating to, say, rallying around the flag effect. So when there is some sort of a war against an external force, how the assumption that society is normally peaceful may not really hold, because society would also tend to rally around the flag, and therefore you tend to understand outcomes like war or conflict at that level of analysis. The third level of analysis, again, this is just a summary. We look at some of the markers at each level of analysis as we go on in the coming slides. But just to summarize, individual level of analysis is usually associated with the kind of characteristics that one associates with a certain type of leadership, um, how every individual is bound by a certain kind of rationality. Is it an ideal type of rationality, the way individuals behave, or is it bounded in the sense that it's bound by the kind of exposure an individual might have had? So if you're looking at a leader that comes from a background, say for example the military, and he's been involved in a certain kind of exposure as far as his personal professional training is concerned, maybe the articulation of policy, maybe the decision making that he brings to the table might be different from another leader who might be trained, say for instance, in academia, and then goes on to handle, say for example, a different set of questions and a different set of problems, and the kind of impact that that leader would bring to the decision making table is something that many a times we come across when people try and explain that these are the reasons why conditions of war might have been exacerbated. Sometimes we tend to ascribe it to individuals also, that it's because of these kind of individuals that situations became good or bad or whatever. So I think this summary is very useful going forward. Some of the aspects relating to a systems level understanding, the good part is that we've covered many of these perspectives when we were discussing different theories in the initial set of lectures that we had. So some of it you might have encountered in a previous context, but it always makes good sense to go over these theories, because they form the mainframe of international relations as a discipline per se. So we had discussed a realist conception when we were looking at a systems level understanding, and in that context, of course, we had examined the contrast with a liberal approach. But here the constructivist approach, again something that we've discussed in earlier classes also, referring to Alexander Wendt and the assertion that anarchy is what states make of it, right? So this is the core of the constructivist approach, wherein we had discuss the idea of intersubjectivity, right? Intersubjectivity is something that we can relate to. We had sort of discussed the examples around nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons with certain countries do not seem to produce a certain kind of response. Say, for example, some countries being designated as the axis of evil, etc. With them, if nuclear weapons are to be found, or if they are pursuing a strategy that inducts nuclear weapons, then it is seen to be more problematic. The point here being that it doesn't seem to be that nuclear weapons per se seems to be the problem, because the presence of nuclear weapons with your allies or with some other countries seems to be okay, but with some countries it seems to be designated as some kind of an existential threat. So very clearly this is intersubjective, right? So your condition or your criterion seems to be that commonly nuclear weapons seem to be not creating as much of a problem as the meaning being attached to certain countries possessing nuclear weapons, right? And so constructivists would have us believe that international relations tend to be socially constructed. They tend to be imbued with social values, norms, and assumptions. It's a very interesting way of looking at the world, because if you then start looking at large parts of Europe, you begin to see a drastic shift in even how Europe has transformed, right? Just in the course of the 20th century, you find that most of the nation states um, were engaged in very bitter kind of rivalries, in very serious kinds of wars, leading to the loss of thousands of people. At that time, interests, the way they were being pursued by states, seemed to be dominated by a purely realist kind of an understanding, where every kind of gain in one partner was seen to be some kind of a loss for the other. It was a purely zero-sum kind of an exercise that one saw. But over the course of particularly the second half of the 20th century, you find that the kind of meanings, the kind of values, the kind of norms that are associated with many of these states, they begin to change. And so therefore, now when you talk of Italy, Germany, France, maybe you don't talk in terms of, World War I, World War II kind of context, but you talk in terms of a common visa area, a common policy around the euro as a currency, the European Central Bank taking on important monetary decisions, and even the entire Eurozone having some sort of a coordinated approach as far as security and defense policy is concerned, right? A common security and defense policy orientation. Very different from the earlier half of the 20th century, where none of them would have been sort of, relying on the other. So the point here is that what might have changed in reality would have been the norms and assumptions and values that you associate with the different states. So it's more about those aspects, right? And somewhere the constructivist approach does begin to make sense. I mean, if you look at the recent, at least the beginning of discussion between India and China, I think again, the aspect of values, norms, and assumptions, it is palpable that there seems to be some shift in the way India is approaching China through the SCO, particularly if you look at recent developments, right? The fact that you might have had a very different set of norms, a very different set of assumptions relating to China 4 years back, 5 years back, in the context of what might have been a militarized kind of a view taken vis-a-vis China. And now the kind of discussions that center on trade, that center on investment, that center on regional groupings being strengthened, like the BRICS Plus initiative, etc. These reveal what? These reveal a different kind of values and norms and assumptions being introduced for essentially the two same actors that we were discussing, with a different set of assumptions at an earlier point in time, right? So when you talk of constructivism, one has to sort of acknowledge the fact that it does have tremendous relevance in the way we could look at interstate relations in the way we could look at outcomes relating to war and peace, as it were, right? So realists view the international system as static. They view war as unavoidable. I think this goes back to our previous discussion, whether it related to classical realists or neo-realists, that history seems to repeat itself. That might have been the orientation realists had, but constructivists argue that that is not necessarily the case. They argue that interests change, identities change over the course of history, which can allow cooperation to be a reality between states. And again, the example that is mentioned, we've discussed it in previous and current contexts as well, about the EU, etc. So I think the constructivist view again offers a fairly robust understanding of many of the changes that we tend to see in the international system, ranging from the contemporary example to the example of the mid 20th century. Of course, Levi introduces other approaches that are seen in international relations. So a brief reference he makes to feminist theorizing, right? And of course, our course is primarily devoted to IR, but some of the approaches here also inform a better understanding of international relations. So feminist theorizing, particularly marked by scholars like Ann Tickner, for example, and we won't be doing individual scholars in detail, but overall, they tend to suggest that there is a gendered nature of states that is obtained in the international system, and there is this gendered nature that is reflected in the world system, which basically implies that, quite simply, when you look at the leadership of international organizations, when you look at the leadership of individual countries, so what you see in the international system, whether it is a collection of institutions, whether it is nation states coexisting with each other, if you examine the leadership, in most cases, not all, in most cases, it seems to be that men seem to be at the forefront, at the leadership of most of these institutions, and therefore a feminist theorizing would suggest that it is this kind of a gendered nature of the international system of states that contributes to the persistence of war in world politics, right? So like I said, scholars like Ann Tickner would expound on this in fair detail, but again, a feminist theorizing approach is usually challenged by the fact that, compared to war, as we had discussed, peace is far more common, right? And therefore it makes it difficult to argue that the gendered nature per se, or masculinity per se, or patriarchy per se can be held to be responsible for majorly causing war, because then in that case you also would say that that same factor is responsible for also ensuring peace for the longest period of time, right? Which then goes against a feminist theorizing on the subject of war and conflict, right? So this is a brief sort of reference that Levi makes to other approaches while looking at the international system as being reflective of a certain kind of masculinity, a certain kind of patriarchy in how institutions and nation states are organized. And going forward, overall, when you sort of evaluate the systems level understanding, I think it is fair to suggest that while anarchy, which is the mainframe of realist scholars, the fact that there is no hierarchical ordering principle, while that might be a permissive cause of war, right? The fact is that there is anarchy all the time. Then why is it that at some times you have war and at other times you have peace? So clearly, if anarchy was the factor that was responsible for these outcomes, then very clearly you are looking at that being somewhat of a structural constant, right? That's a fair criticism that is pointed out against the realists. So anarchy might be a permissive cause of war, but again it remains a structural constant, and therefore it cannot account for variations in war and peace, right? And similarly for the idea of feminist theorizing, that if it was a certain kind of masculinity that is pervasive in the leadership of nation states and institutions, then that should be held sort of, or that should be credited for the fact that we've been at peace for the maximum amount of time. So in order to understand for these variations, that's why Levi introduces the idea of trying to look at maybe another level of analysis. That's his basic point, that don't remain fixated on a systems level kind of understanding. Anarchy per se is always a structural constant. So if you have to look at variations, why X war occurs or why a certain kind of conflict gets exacerbated, then you might have to sorry, come down to a different level of analysis, right? And therefore, other levels of analysis are introduced by Levi, as we had mentioned. There would be the governmental level, societal level kind of understanding. We'll see some of those. But just to recap that idea of the importance of levels of analysis, I think when we had discussed in the introductory segment, we had basically made out a case that when we look at levels of analysis, we sort of use it as a framework for classifying independent variables, right? That distinction between independent and dependent variables has to be very clear. Dependent variable is that which you are trying to explain. So your dependent variable is war. Your dependent variable is constant. You're trying to explain that. How do you explain that? You're trying to explain it through a multi-pronged approach. That's where, the independent variables come, the variables that are used to explain war. It could be a systems level understanding. It could be maybe a national or a governmental level understanding. It could be a societal level understanding. It could be also an individual level of understanding. So if you're trying to look at a set of independent variables, it is then that the levels of analysis framework becomes useful, because then you are able to sum up whatever is the explanatory factor that accrues to each level of analysis in order to better understand your dependent variable. So if you are looking at India, Pakistan and a certain kind of security competition or a certain kind of security dilemma, then you are looking at a summation of different factors. How is it that it is explained at the systems level? Of course, you reach out to arguments like anarchy. Of course, you reach out to arguments in constructivism that there is a certain norm, there is a certain value, there is a certain quality that is ascribed to Pakistan, which is why there is a certain view that is taken on Pakistan. Then you come to the level of society. Do people get animated on questions of war and peace equally when we discuss, say, for example, Bhutan, or when we discuss, say, for example, Nepal vis-a-vis Pakistan? So there is a difference that one might sort of ascribe to how society would respond to how the relationship with Pakistan emerges. And then, of course, at the level of individuals, how do you look at the leadership under, say, former Prime Minister Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and the fact that there was a certain way of dealing with Pakistan? Or how do you look at the leadership of Dr. Manmohan Singh or Mr. Narendra Modi as far as dealing with Pakistan is concerned? So very clearly, when you want to look at India, Pakistan, there is a whole host of independent variables that when sort of taken together are able to give you a clearer picture of a certain kind of outcome related to war or conflict vis-a-vis a certain set of countries, right? So that is the point which is highlighted here, that the levels of analysis is a very useful framework for classifying independent variables, right? So whether war derives from the international system, it derives from the national society or bureaucracy, or it derives from individual decision makers, or it is a mix of all of these, you are able to sort of aggregate these when considered as independent variables, right? Of course, we had also made a point that one should not mix up the dependent variable with the independent variables at different times. And if you are focusing on the leadership, then sort of that becomes the dependent variable. Then you cannot mix it up with other factors. If you're simply looking at, okay, under the prime ministership of leader X, this seems to have been the overwhelming approach. So you're trying to explain that. That cannot be then mixed with, the anarchy argument or the argument relating to norms. That cannot be then mixed by the argument of, the nation state, etc. So very clearly, levels of analysis become a very useful framework which helps you understand how the dependent variable gets explained, the dependent variable being the entity whose behavior is to be explained, basically looking at outcomes in the international system or outcomes relating to two states, how they are best explained by a certain set of independent variables that belong to different levels, whether it is the system, whether it is society, whether it is the individual. The caveat, as I mentioned, on using the levels of analysis framework is that if you use it as a framework of independent variables, then you are able to aggregate all of these factors. So when you explain India-Pakistan relations, you can say that yes, at the systems level, these are the factors that explain the good or bad state of relations. At the level of society, these are the factors that explain the good or bad state of relations. And at the level of leaders, this is what explains, right? And then aggregation becomes possible. But as dependent variables, like I said, you cannot aggregate them because you're looking at them as separate variables. And therefore, the correlations that you obtain at one level would not be valid very clearly at the other. Other than levels of analysis framework, causes of war are also framed as paradigm wars, right? These are the normal debates that one sees broadly between realism and liberalism. So when we look at IR theory, if you go back to our first set of lectures, we would have been looking at paradigm debates, discussions as far as realism and liberalism broadly, the two major approaches was concerned. But when you come down one level deeper, it becomes again very relevant to note that a levels of analysis framework offers you a much more deeper insight into these questions of war and peace, right? Again, just to recap, like I said, some of the points might be overlapping with our previous discussion on core theory. So the liberal tradition broadly was what? The liberal tradition broadly suggested that anarchy, unlike what the realists ascribe meaning to it, that anarchy basically perpetuates a certain kind of outcome, which is basically repetition of war. The liberal tradition suggests that anarchy does not mean that it has to be some kind of disorder always, right? Liberal tradition would argue that states have common interests as well as conflictual interests. It's not that states are always either perpetually fighting or perpetually cooperating. It can be a mix of these. According to the liberal tradition, the states would always try and maximize economic welfare and provide for security, and would create international institutions that regulate conflict and promote cooperation. I think the entire spectrum of approaches within the liberal tradition, whether it was Republican liberalism about how democracies don't go to war with each other, or whether it was interdependence liberalism that we covered previously, I think all of those approaches in a way get reflected by these concerns, whether it revolves around economic welfare, whether it revolves around institutions and their ability to regulate conflict, promote cooperation, etc. And these again fall under the broader description of being theories related to the causes of war. So you have a broad realist approach, you have a broad liberal approach. Again, the realist approach would be some common factors that we've discussed, that key actors in world politics would be sovereign states. They act in a very rational manner. Rationality is defined as the constant need to survive. So survival is what determines the characteristic of rationality. In states, they would want to perpetually improve their security, improve their power, improve their wealth in a system that is perpetually about conflict. And the reason being that there is no legitimate supranational government authority where you can go to, and that's why self-help becomes important. I think these are points which have come in our previous discussions also, so I wouldn't belabor on this further. Security dilemma again is the core argument that realists make, that because you're always dependent on self-help, because you don't have a supranational authority to go to in the event of a conflict or some other disagreement, there is always this fear that whatever one state is doing is going to be antithetical to your interests, right? That is the core of the realist understanding. So that is what is explained by the security dilemma, that it is essentially a zero-sum kind of an understanding, wherein even a defensively motivated effort by a state for their own security can result in the other state pursuing serious um, accumulation of military capability, etc., which then creates some kind of a spiral. It creates some kind of a domino effect, as a result of which you have conflict emerging as the only outcome possible for both states, even though the first action by the state might have been just for their own security, right? But that is not how other states see it. So I think this core differentiation was discussed. The other differentiation when we look at the systemic level is relating to transition of power. So when we look at a systems level understanding, it's also interesting to see how at the systems level transition of power is understood. Basically, how do we see one hegemon giving way to another hegemon, right? And so we had discussed here previously this contrast between defensive realists and offensive realists, if you recollect, right? Defensive realists suggesting that there is always going to be some kind of balance of power that emerges, that ensures that there is stability. According to this understanding, you should always have a sufficient amount of power, right? Anything which is perceived by other states to be a run for hegemony would be responded to or retaliated by some of those states coming together, forming some kinds of alliances, forming some kind of military buildup, and that is sufficient enough to check the run for hegemony that any state tries to make. They feel that movement towards unipolarity is essentially destabilizing, right? That's one way of looking at things. Versus hegemonic theory, again reflected in our previous discussion of offensive realism. Basically, they would suggest that, well, it does make sense to run for hegemony, right? It does make sense to move towards concentration of power in a unipolar kind of a manner. The reason being that if you are able to do that, one, the assumption that there would be some kind of check or balance against you by others coming together in terms of some kind of an alliance, that according to them doesn't always work, because they feel that many of the states will just pass the buck. They'll just leave it to other states to tackle the rising hegemon, and nobody wants to be at the forefront of being seen to be some kind of a collective or some kind of an alliance against the hegemon. And that in a way sort of allows that force build up to fizzle away against the hegemon, right? And the other factor they feel is the right thing to do is running in for hegemony would allow you to control the subsequent architecture of how interstate relations are to be governed. So whether it is the political architecture through organizations like the United Nations and the other set of associated institutions, or whether it is the economic architecture of the international system, whether it is through the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, World Bank, whether it is through the World Trade Organization, etc., you are able to sort of, in a way, decide on what would the architecture of the world look like and make it conducive to your way of functioning. So, you as a liberal democracy would want less of the state in business, and so you would want to push that kind of an agenda in the international system through these institutions, which is only possible where you are the overwhelming power, right? If you have that kind of weight, if you have that kind of muscle, only then you are able to push for these kind of institutions to proliferate. And therefore, according to one set of scholars, hegemonic theory does make a lot of sense, right? Power transition theory, again, is a form of hegemonic theory. What does power transition theory suggest? It suggests that there is existence of order within the hierarchical system that is obtained when you have a hegemon, right? The fact that you have a hegemon doesn't mean that everything is in disorder. There's a certain way of organizing international politics. There's a certain way of organizing the structure of the international economic system, right? And hegemons, they play the important part as far as creating political and economic structures and norms are concerned, and this enhances the stability of the system. So according to them, when you have transition through the rise of a hegemon, it doesn't mean that the international system gets destabilized. It only means that the hegemon would have created a new set of political and economic structures and norms of behavior to enhance the stability of the system. It's very interesting if you look at the example of the United States, particularly post World War II. I think it's fairly evident that the political and economic structures and norms that we see today in the international system seem to be precisely governed by this logic of how this transition with the rise of the overwhelming power in the international system has been made. There are economic structures, there are political structures that we can relate to that have been the basis of the stability that we see in the international system, and that have been the result of what this hegemon has wanted to establish. If we were to look at an alternate possibility, something that many scholars discuss today by way of the challenge that China is posing, the kind of heft that China has, being the second largest economy in the world today. There are questions that are being raised that that might be associated with a different set of political and economic structures and norms of behavior, and which is quite possible. I mean, of course, right now this is in the realm of a hypothetical discussion, but one is likely to see a different set of norms emerging if the existing hegemon were to be replaced by another hegemon. Maybe ideas relating to democracy, maybe ideas relating to human rights, maybe ideas relating to environmental norms, maybe ideas relating to individual rights and liberties might be interpreted differently, right? Of course, it is difficult for me to convincingly say how it might be changed. You never know that, given the fact that China has co-opted itself into the international system all of these years, working with international institutions, working in the international system, it might not want to go too far away from the median. But still, there is that belief that every hegemon would want to create a set of political and economic structures that are conducive to its own understanding of the international system. How does this transition happen? Well, differential rates of growth, some kind of imperial overextension, development of vested domestic interests, all of these could lead to the rise and fall of hegemons, right? And it's difficult to say what might be the next set of factors that may or may not bring about the change. But if you look at the previous transition, the fact that overextension, imperial overextension, is associated with one of the reasons of maybe Britain's clout coming to an end is very clearly sort of illustrated by how history has panned out. Differential rates of growth, the fact that if you look at one of the most promising stories in the early part of the 20th century was the rise of the United States as an engine of growth, as an engine of industrial growth, and therefore that differential rate of growth meant that it was a serious kind of challenge to the previous hegemon in the international system, right? And according to power transition theory, the probability of a major war is greatest at the point when the declining leader is being overtaken by the rising challenger. This is something that is articulated in contemporary IR literature also as the Thucydidean trap, right? So Thucydides, someone we had discussed as part of our classical realism discussion. Today, scholars like Graham Allison refer to the Thucydidean trap precisely to explain this power transition theory. The fact that the probability of a major war is greatest at the point when the declining leader is being overtaken by the rising challenger. In such circumstances, either the challenger initiates a war to bring its benefits from the system into line with its rising military power, or the declining leader initiates a preventive war or a preemptive war to block the rising challenger, right? And I think on this note, I will bring today's class to a close, more when we meet in the next class.